Okay, Shalom and Erev Tov. Good evening to everyone. Thanks for everyone for being here. My name is Ben, and I am the Chief Planning Officer of the Jewish Federation of Greater Metro West, New Jersey. Before I get started, I just want to point out so everybody knows that we're recording our session this evening as we share with you the recently released 2020 community study of the Greater Metro West Jewish community. I haven't met everyone in the community yet because I'm new to the Federation team. I just started at Federation in August. So for those of you who I have met, it's great to see you. For those of you I haven't met yet, I hope we get to meet sometime soon in a more intimate one-on-one or smaller group in-person setting than on a Zoom with 30 other people. But I'm really glad to be here, and it's really been a great first few months for me in this wonderful federation and in the Greater Metro West Jewish community. I've been just welcomed so warmly by my colleagues, by the amazing leadership and volunteers in our community, and by so many out across the catchment area of our federation. So thank you for the warm welcome. And it's been really a great time for me to start because it's really an exciting moment in the history of the Greater Metro West Jewish community to have this community study coming our way right at this special moment. The purpose of the 2020 community study is to provide the Greater Metro West Jewish community with reliable information to help all of us, those of us who work at the Federation, but also throughout the Jewish community, to better fulfill our mission to care for people in need and to build a vibrant Jewish community in Greater Metro West. We haven't collected this sort of data in our area in over 20 years. So a couple of years ago already, the leadership of the Federation decided to invest in a state-of-the-art research study to learn about ourselves. We engaged with the Maurice and Marilyn Cohen Center for Modern Jewish Studies at Brandeis University, which is a renowned multidisciplinary research institute dedicated to the study of American Jewry and religious and cultural identity. The community study was just released a couple of weeks ago and is available on the Federation website. Maybe you've already gotten a chance to take a look at it. And you can read the entire study there. All of the reports are there. This evening, we invite you into the conversation about what the study is and what it might mean for us. We're really pleased that we have Janet Aaronson, the lead researcher of our community study, here with us tonight. And she's going to be sharing some details about the community study, how she went about this challenging process of figuring out all this data about our community, and also a selection of key findings. And then we'll have time after Janet presents for some questions that you can ask about the community study, and Janet will do her best to answer them. So that's the plan for this evening, and let me introduce Janet. Janet Krasner Aronson is the Associate Director of the Cohen Center for Modern Jewish Studies at Brandeis University. She earned her doctorate in social policy at the Heller School for Social Policy at Brandeis. And she's directed and contributed to local Jewish community studies in over a dozen communities. Recently, the study of Chicago that was released, and the most recent one being of our community, Greater Metro West. And Janet is especially happy to be learning about her home community here in Greater Metro West. She grew up in Union, is a proud graduate of what was then called the Solomon Schechter Day School of Essex and Union. We now know and love it as the Golda Ak Academy. And so it's really great to welcome Janet back to the Greater Metro West community, and I'll hand it over to Janet to share the community study results with us all.
Thank you, Ben, and thanks to everybody for being here. I hope you can all see the slides. So today I'm going to go through quite a bit of data fairly quickly. Everything that you see is in the report, and the purpose of the presentation today is to explain some of the big ideas that are in the report, some new ideas particularly related to Jewish engagement, and sort of pique your curiosity, I hope, so that you will go on your own to look at the report after this. Little bit of framing, and I'll spend a few minutes just talking about how we did this study, then get into two main topics. The one is Jewish engagement in general, and specifically about synagogue participation. As you read the findings, what we're going to look at today, and as you read the report, I want to give you a couple of ideas to think about. One is that all of the data that's in the report is based on survey results. It's estimates of what would we have found out if we asked every single Jewish household in Greater Metro West the same questions. Just like I'm sure many people are familiar with election polls. These are estimates. So there's a sort of margin of error. All of the numbers are plus or minus a certain amount, and it varies from number to number. But the thing to take away from that is not to get too hung up on the precise numbers, but what's really important is the patterns. What groups are lower? Which groups are higher? Where do you see the main differences? And in the report itself, anytime something is shaded, it means that there's a significant difference in those numbers. If it's not shaded, it means even though some of the numbers are different, there's not really a story there. A brief word about the survey itself. We collected responses from nearly 3,300 households in Greater Metro West. That is a very large sample for a community survey. We were really successful about reaching people. You see down at the bottom, the response rate was over 33%. In comparison, many of you are likely familiar with the Pew study. They had a response of just over 16%. And that's really more typical. So we were really successful at reaching people. Of course, the success of the study is not just reaching the people who are easy to reach, but also the people who are hard to reach. And that's where we invested most of our efforts. It's also important with the study to keep in mind that we were collecting data between October and December 2020. And that's someday, hopefully those dates won't be as meaningful, but right now we have to keep in mind of the context that it was all during COVID. And we did a lot of thinking about how to modify the questions and understand the findings in light of the COVID pandemic. And there are places where we talk about that specifically. So I'm going to give you just some key findings of the study as a whole, the demographics, and then we'll get into the topics for the evening. So the first question that everybody wants to know is, how large is the community? And you can see here that there are a lot of numbers. We answer that question in a lot of different ways. The first number on top is the number of Jewish people who live in Greater Metro West, which is over 122,000. They live in almost 57,000 households, where a household is defined as a group of people who live together, where that includes at least one Jewish adult. But of course, not everybody in those households is Jewish. So when you think about all of the people in Jewish households, that is 155,000 individuals. Now, how are these? There are a lot of different definitions for being Jewish. We use a variant of a standard social science definition. There are 96,900 Jewish adults. Those are people who consider themselves to be Jewish, either as their religion or culturally or ethnically. And in addition, they need to have some kind of Jewish background, which could mean that they have a Jewish parent, either parent, they were raised Jewish, or they converted. Now this group also includes some people who are Jewish and another religion, and that is considered Jewish for this study. For children, it's a little bit simpler. It's if their parents consider them Jewish, then so do we. And these also, in some cases, are children who the parents say that they're Jewish and another religion. The geography is all of Essex, Union, and Morris County, and then further to the west. You can see it here that the red dots show the density of Jewish households. So each red dot equals about 25 Jewish households. You can't find them specifically, don't look for your house, but you could see that Essex County here has the highest density of Jewish people. It also has the highest share of Jewish people. 38% of Jewish households are in Essex, 25% are in East Morris, 19% are 18% are in Union, and about the same are in Western Greater Metro West. Now, a couple of points about geography and why did we make this region so big? Well, the way, for the purposes of analyzing the study, it doesn't matter as much how many Jewish households live in the region. The question is, how many respondents do we have from a given area? Because we need that to statistically in order to analyze them and say something reliable about any of the groups. So because the density of all of this greater Metro West is relatively low, there are not a lot of Jewish households, we had to make it a pretty big region, including part of Morris County, to have enough respondents there so we could tell you anything about the people in that region. Because the other regions are more dense, we could cover a smaller area. There have been a lot of questions already, and there always are, about can we drill down more? Can we find out how many Jews live in Livingston or Randolph or any of the other areas on this map? So we do have data on zip code level, but in most cases, there aren't enough respondents in any zip code to tell you anything about the number of Jews. That was not the design of this study. But one of the things that we can look into as we explore the data further is seeing where we can say more and provide more details. So that's something that will come down the road. Some more information about the households. About 3/4 of households include a couple. These could be a couple who are married or partnered. And of those couples, about half of them are in-married, 2 Jews married to each other, and about half are intermarried, 1 Jewish person and 1 non-Jewish person. The intermarriage rate in Greater Metro West is a little bit lower than the national average. 30% of households include a minor child. That's anyone under 18. And of all the Jewish children in Greater Metro West, about the same number are being raised by intermarried and in-married parents. It's almost half for each. And the remainder, 8%, are being raised by single parents. In terms of income and standard of living, there's a lot of information in the report about measures of economic vulnerability, and we invite you to read all of that. But this is just 2 basic measures. We have income. A lot of people don't share their income information, and I'm sure you all know that income is not a precise descriptor of financial well-being. So we also ask people to describe their own standard of living, and we can see that 15% of households said that they're just managing to make ends meet, and 2% said they cannot make ends meet. These 2 groups together, 17%, are what we call financially struggling, and you're going to see a lot of references to that group throughout the report. A couple of noteworthy observations during COVID is that overall, 22% of households said that their financial situation was worse because of the pandemic. And the financially struggling households were suffering from the downturn much more than all other households. And that's a whole other area that we can discuss. I'm going to move on to Jewish engagement. First, I'll start with the measures of Jewish engagement that people are most familiar with, which is denominations. And this shows a comparison of the Jewish adults in Greater Metro West compared to all Jewish adults. And you can see the share that Orthodox is a little smaller than average. These numbers I mentioned earlier about whether there's a real difference, there may not be that much of a difference. They're both in the single digits. Conservative is a little higher than average. Reform, just about the same. The big story in Jewish denominations throughout the country, not just in Greater Metro West, is the share of people who say they have no denomination. And you can see that it's 38% of Greater Metro West Jewish adults, just about the same as national. Of that group, half of them said, when asked, what is your denomination? Half of them said that they're secular or cultural Jews, and half of them said that they are just Jewish. And we're going to look a little bit later about what they mean, what these mean, but as a preview, this does not mean that they are Jewishly disconnected and unengaged. We've developed a tool, another way of measuring Jewish engagement. The first one, denomination, there are a couple of issues with it. One is, as I said, a lot of people don't identify with the denomination. They don't like the labels. None of those sort of speak to them. Another limitation is that that's really based on ritual, religious behavior. It doesn't encompass what do you do culturally? How many of your friends are Jewish? What do you watch? Do you talk about Jewish life with your friends? Sort of how immersed are you in the Jewish community? So we've developed a new way to measure and kind of create a typology of Jewish engagement that's based on a diversity of measures of Jewish engagement, Jewish behaviors. And this diversity is expressed in 5 patterns of Jewish engagement, which I'll show you in a moment. The 5 patterns, keep in mind, these are meant to be descriptive patterns. We're saying some people do more of this, some people do more of that. Our aim is not to rank them, and we do put them in order for convenience, but we're not trying to evaluate. We're simply trying to describe what is going on in the Jewish community. And I also want to reiterate that these are patterns that we see in the community. There was no question on the survey that said, which one of these are you? And we named them based on the behaviors that we saw. We have a similar model in all of the Jewish community studies that we conduct, but they are all unique to that community. And this is unique to Greater Metro West. So we have 5 patterns of Jewish engagement, and I'll talk briefly about what they are. The group there's a 14% of Jewish adults who are in the group we call immersed. That means they do everything in Jewish life, the ritual, the cultural, and the personal or individual activities. Almost all of the people in that group do almost all of those things. At the other end, 16%, just about the same amount, are minimally involved. They do very little in Jewish life, and many of them do none of these things. The 2 largest groups are what we call the familial and the personal. The familiar group, what they do in Jewish life, they're not members of organizations, they're not doing a lot of ritual things, but they do what we call the home and family-based holidays. These are 2 popular, most common Jewish celebrations, which are Passover Seder and Hanukkah candle lighting. That is their primary engagement with Jewish life. Another quarter, the same amount, is engaged in personal Jewish life. That means they're not doing ritual or communal activities, but they're doing things at home with their friends, like Jewish cultural activities, following news about Israel. And the involved group, which is 15%, is almost like the immersed group, but a little bit less. They do less of those things. They don't do everything. And this very colorful chart is designed just to show you what those patterns are and list out the 20 behaviors that were used to create this index. And you can see the darker colors mean more of the people in the group do that thing. So you can see here the immersed, almost everybody does everything. And here you can see that the personal, they do all of these individual activities. So this is really just for you to explore. And the main thing here is to think about, how does this, what does it say about Jewish engagement? How does this describe what people are doing now? And how would you use that to perhaps enhance or deepen the Jewish engagement of those who are interested in it? I'm going to use this slide just to explain the difference between Jewish engagement and denomination. So you can see here at the bottom, I mentioned that the high number of people, I think it was 38%, who said they have no denomination. And you could see of those people, there are some of those 38% are in every single one of these engagement groups. So only a quarter of the people with no denomination are minimally involved, have very little Jewish behaviors, and most of them have some kind of Jewish behavior. So this is just to give you a framework for understanding Jewish engagement, and this becomes kind of a key to understanding a lot of the other behaviors in the report. One of those ways we understand it is, how does this correlate with attitudes? So we talked about behaviors, but what does this mean about Jewish life? And you can see that this immersed group and the ones who do everything, you can see that 65% of them say being Jewish is very much part of their daily life. The involved group, where I said they do a lot of the Jewish things, but not quite as much as the immersed group, you can see from this that their attitude about being Jewish and being part of their daily life looks very different than the immersed group. So we can see that the attitudes sort of correlate and correspond to Jewish behaviors. And this really paints a picture of what Jewish engagement looks like. And I'm happy to take questions about that after we're done, but I'm going to spend some time going through information about synagogues that I know this is important to this group. I'm going to start out just with synagogue membership. 29% of households include a synagogue member. This is just about the same as the national average, although the national talks about people in whether people are members of synagogues rather than households. So this is the right is people, this is households. 25%, almost all of them, are members of a brick and mortar synagogue, and they pay dues by brick and mortar. I mean, it's sort of a synagogue with a building and clergy and a dues structure. Of that group, 13% are members of Orthodox synagogues, 40% conservative, 39% Reform, and 10 other. It's really important to differentiate this from that earlier slide, which is how people describe their own denomination, not the denomination of the synagogue they belong to. Attendance at services. This is a place where we had to think about the impact of the pandemic. About half of people never attended a service in the past 6 months. Half of them did. And we include in this question, we said online or in person. About 71% of people did not ever attend a synagogue program other than services, and the remainder, about 30%, did at least once. I talked about these differences in Jewish engagement, and here we can see it in a particular type of behavior. So of that immersed group, almost everyone is a member of a synagogue. Almost everybody attends services at least once. Almost everybody attended high holiday services. The involved group, a little bit less. And each group there's a difference in their synagogue membership and participation. One thing that's really interesting to note, though, is that for all of these groups, attendance at services is higher than membership. So there are people who are not non-members who are attending services, and that's worth exploring further. Differences by region. You can see here, just as an example, that synagogue membership is highest in Essex and Union and much lower in the Western Greater Metro West. Differences by financial status. People who are well off, much more likely to be synagogue members than people who are financially struggling. I mentioned earlier that when something is shaded, that means it's statistically significant. In these other cases, it's not significant. So in fact, there's no financial correlation for attending services. People of all financial statuses are attending services at the same rate, but there is a difference in synagogue membership. I see a typo, I'm sorry. By marital status, not surprising that in married couples much more likely to be synagogue members and attend services. And here's some Jewish ritual practices. We have a lot more details about these in the report and who is doing what, but just to give you a sense of it, the majority of people light Hanukkah candles and attended a Seder. This is pretty common pattern in the American Jewish community that these are the highest. Fasting on Yom Kippur, mark Shabbat in any way, which could mean ever lights candles or had a special meal. And the smallest one is keeping kosher at home. So that takes us through a very high level overview of synagogue and Jewish engagement, and I welcome your questions.
Thank you so much, Janet. So what we're going to do now is have some questions and answers. Because we are a group of almost 20 people, we're going to ask you to submit your questions in the chat, and I'll monitor the chat and pose the questions to Janet as they come in, and then she'll do her best to share with us some thoughts and answers. So while you're starting to put some of your first questions into the chat, a word about the types of questions that are going to be helpful right now. So please do ask about anything Janet presented tonight, any of her slides, any of the methodologies that she talked about, or anything you read in the reports that are up on our website in the weeks since they've been released. And if you have something in the reports you want to ask about, if you're even able to say, oh yeah, it was in this report on this page, that's great. Janet has her reports available and can respond to them. But what we can expect from Janet, she led this team on this massive data collection, and it's a huge data set. We, as great as Janet is at presenting this material, we do not expect her to have put it all to memory. So please, don't ask Janet to quote some statistic that she hasn't presented or that you don't have in front of you in the reports, because that would be, that would be very hard for any of us to do. And so we're going to try and, not expect that of Janet either. So again, questions about anything she presented tonight or anything in the reports, and you can just write them in the chat, and that way we can attend to them. So we'll give everybody a moment to put questions in the chat. Okay, so we've got a couple of questions here. One is about, how to think about some of the membership issues, Janet, that you brought up in terms of, differences between in-married and intermarried households, as well as the financial differences that were statistically significant. And I think this question here from Valerie starts to ask, like, well, how do we understand that, and how might we make meaning of some of those cross tabulations to figure out, for example, in synagogue leadership, they're thinking about due structures.
Okay, there's a lot packed into that question. I'll try to untangle some of it. So one of the sort of methodological challenges here is we're looking at each of these items separately. We're looking at differences in synagogue membership by financial status and region and by marital status. And the magic here is you really want to put them together, and you want to say, well, our intermarried families more likely to be synagogue members because they're wealthier or because they live in places where there are more synagogues, or is it just because they prefer to be members of synagogues? And generally the answer is yes to all of those. All of those are true, and they kind of reinforce each other. On the one hand, people choose to live, if Judaism, Jewish community is important to people, they choose to live in places where there are a lot of synagogue choices. But there are many people who choose places to live for other reasons, whether it's the cost of living or where their family lives or where their jobs are, or commute times. And then at some point later, they're looking for a synagogue, and then they have to decide how far they're willing to go. So these are all interrelated factors. It's kind of hard to disentangle them. What I think is most interesting, I've talked to a lot of folks around the country about the dues structure and the big question, what gets people to be involved with synagogues? And I think it's part of the entire trend of belonging, the feeling of making a commitment. What does it mean? Financial limitations doesn't always mean that people can't afford synagogues. It might mean that they don't value it, or at a particular point in time in their lives. I think that the strategy needs to be to look at participation in synagogues, and to look at how do people participate in synagogues without having to commit to being a member, and maybe encourage the participation first, and then the membership may come. So I think that an important data point that I mentioned in the report is the number of people who attend services, even though they're not members of synagogues. And that's a really interesting question to ask during COVID, although even before COVID, we found that to be true in most communities. But where were they attending services? Was it local, or did they say, hey, I'm going to try out this synagogue in New York or LA or Jerusalem? So that really expands the opportunities. The other thing I might look into is that information about program participation. People who participate in programs without being members of synagogues. And I can't offer you these specific numbers, but I do know in some places that number is a little bit higher. So synagogues offer more programs, non-services, to non-members, or to the community, as a way to welcome people and get them through the door. So those are just some opportunities. We could talk more.
Thanks, Janet. So, it's interesting, Janet, you and I have talked a bunch about, and you started at the top, that the power is not in one number, but it's in how the numbers relate to each other in those cross tabulations. And there, I think there's a few questions here that relate to that. So I don't know if you're going to be able to answer them right now, because, we may have not done that analysis yet, but Robert, had a couple of questions. One was about, analysis of, the cross tabulation, I guess, between people who are members of synagogues and their denominational affiliations, the people who aren't members of synagogues and what their denominational affiliations and behaviors are. And if there was, pieces there that, could be teased out. Well, maybe we'll start there, and then I'll go to another question.
Okay. We haven't done that analysis, so you're absolutely right. I think this is a good time to think about what could be done next. And because we collect both what is your denomination and what is the denomination of your synagogue, we can look at that. I mean, the typical patterns are that Orthodox Jews are more likely to be an Orthodox. I mean, most people are in the synagogues that they affiliate with, the denominations, but there are a lot of among conservative and Reform Jews. There are a fair number, and I expect to be true here as well, who are not members of synagogues at all or members of a different denomination. So yes, definitely worth digging into more and understanding those patterns.
Right. And just to just to point out here, Janet, that on your website there are some charts available for those people who want to start digging in themselves on the Cohen Center website. But we're also, I'll just say, as a community, as I'm having these conversations not only tonight but a whole series of different virtual information sessions, I'm gathering also the questions that are coming up so that we can follow up, like Janet said, with the things that are on people's minds that aren't yet reported out, and we'll be able to take those next steps. So another question here was about actually, Robert, maybe you want to just write in the chat for me exactly what the thing is about intermarriage so that I can ask the question correctly. I'm going to go to a different question now, and then we'll get to that one in a second.
I just gotta say, I'm not seeing the messages in the chat. Are they going directly?
Yes, for some reason they're coming to me directly.
Okay, fine.
So
okay.
I'm the moderator your way, Janet.
Okay.
Okay. So one question here is about which of the reports to take a look at. So Mary writes, she says, other than the children and religious education and early childhood reports, what other reports would you direct the attention of synagogue leaders?
I would start with the overview, and I would look very carefully at the community connections one. I actually think personally that it is the most interesting report. One of the things that's in there is the information about the feelings of connection to the local community, and even more important, barriers to the connection. So we had a question that said, of the following conditions, which one limits your involvement in the Jewish community? The number one response was, I don't know enough people. So those questions were designed to really guide you in thinking what are the barriers to engagement. The number two was COVID. We hope that one will go away on its own, but the other ones are all definitely actionable. And you could you can also look at where are there differences for different groups. And so if you're trying to engage different groups, that's probably one of the most valuable charts in the whole report.
Thanks, Janet. You can see Mary Roach. That's how helpful that was.
Oh, good.
So I'm just gonna, Jen, I'm gonna ask this question. If you don't know exactly off the top of your head, that's okay, because I don't have the specific place to point to you. But Robert said that he noted that there was a low level of intermarriage reported among younger age segments, and was interested about your thoughts about that.
Okay, great question, great observation. It is because younger people who are married are more likely to be Orthodox. So that's a pretty typical pattern, that intermarriage among, so of the people who are married at the youngest age, they're more likely to be Orthodox. So if you look at their people in their 30s and early 40s, as non-Orthodox people get married, then the intermarriage rate goes up.
Great, thanks, Janet. That makes sort of common sense when you think about it, and it also.
But you have to think about it, right?
That you gathered.
Right.
I think I've asked all the questions I've put in the chat. If there are other questions, please, folks, please put them in. Janet, one of the things we've heard a bunch of times is about, people who've lived in the community for a long time wonder, how does this data relate to what we knew about the community in the past, or any trends? And we've talked about this a bit. Maybe you can comment on that.
Well, the greater Metro West community has shifted and evolved a little bit with borders and the composition, As Ben mentioned, I grew up in Union. I think Union looks very different now than it did in the 70s. The population really switched. So we did the previous study, the last full demographic study was in 1998, I think. And it's kind of hard to compare apples and apples to then, which is why we didn't really focus on it. There has been an increase in Jewish population, and there even for accounting for some of the changes in the geography. But again, it's sort of not apples to apples for all sorts of reasons that I could discuss it if people are interested. But I think one of the unique characteristics of Greater Metro West, and I think I don't need to tell you this, but just the composition of the community is that it's not like most communities with a city and sort of an urban center and suburbs. I mean, now I live in Boston. You know, we have these areas where the young people live in Boston and Cambridge and Somerville, and then there's the suburbs with the old people, or the middle-aged people and the young kids, and then there's a big trend of young people living in the city longer. We see that in most other places, but we don't see that in Greater Metro West because it is primarily suburbs. So we really have to think about the community differently. Most of the young people, young adults who are reflected in this study are probably young adults living in their parents' houses. They're not, 25-year-old renting an apartment with 3 roommates and commuting into the city. So it's a really different community. And so I think as a community of families, couples, I mean, the rate of marriage is very high. That so many couples, so many households have couples. And I mean, keeping in mind of those people who are not married, some of them are young and some of them are older and they're widows and divorced and of course never married. So it's a really different kind of community. And I think that affects a lot of the dynamics if you were comparing to another community.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Janet. So it's really like a snapshot of our particular community at this particular time.
Right.
So there's a question here about Birthright Israel. I know that we have a whole section of a whole report of the community study about Israel connections. And I know there's some data in there about questions about people participating in Birthright. And the question here is about, again, are we able to cross tab against folks who participated in Birthright against some of the other types of questions you asked around affiliation and engagement?
So if the director of our center, Len Sachs, were on this call, and he's sorry he couldn't join us, that's his main area of research and interest is looking at the long-term impact of Birthright, and he could tell you anything you want to know. We did not study this. We reported the number of people who've been on Birthright, but we didn't really look at the differences. I do know consistently from other data that there is a long-term impact of Birthright participation. Now, there is something new in this study that we haven't dug into, which we have not asked in other communities, which is asking about parents, whether anyone in your household has gone on Birthright. It happens that my dissertation was on the parents of Birthright alumni and whether there's an impact on the parents of their children going. So that's something that's a personal interest. We haven't dug into it. I don't know if we have enough respondents to say anything, but that would be an area of great interest. I am confident we would find a long-term Birthright impact.
Janet, is there some of this research about Birthright on the Cohen Center website if people wanted to go dig it?
A ton, and I'm happy to point you in the right direction. Yeah.
Great, thanks, Janet. One more question. So on the Index of Jewish Engagement, you pointed out that very powerful, chart where over half of the folks were categorized into the personal and familial groups. And the question is, do you think, and by the way, again, not sure you're gonna be able to answer this, but you'll do your best. Do you think those are people, they're in the personal segment because they engage so highly in those personal behaviors? Are they open to joining Jewish institutions and organizations? Is that question of openness and the attitude data that we have?
Well, I'm looking, I could share the slide again, but I actually will share the slide so that I can talk through this, but and how I think about this. But I think some of them might be, but I am going to maybe reframe the question a little bit. Is the way I would look at the best use of these data is not necessarily to take people in one of these columns and try to move them into the next column. These are sort of in order, but these are not really in order. And I'll explain that in a second. It's not a ladder. It's a set of patterns. And when I think about what does it mean to deepen the Jewish engagement of somebody in the personal group, I don't think of it as saying real Jewish engagement means being a member of a synagogue. So what do we have to do to get you to join a synagogue? Instead, I think of it as you've told us that you like to do lots of Jewish things, but you don't like to do them with organizations, or you don't like to belong, you don't like to commit. What would make Jewish engagement more meaningful to you? So probably it would be to attend programs or to do things at home that don't require joining an organization, but are meaningful. So what are the ways so I think that that's the group that is really right for online Jewish life. And what resources can you provide to people at home, and maybe connect them to one another without creating, I would say, the barrier of saying you have to join an organization in order to participate. And to dig into this a little bit, what you can see here is that of that group, almost 60% attended an online program during COVID. There's a very high level of participation, even though 18% are synagogue members. And you can see that's what they're choosing to do. They're attending programs, they're not attending synagogues. I just want to use this as long as up again to really emphasize what I meant about it's not really in order. You can see this personal group, they're all doing these personal activities. And the involved group, where you look at them quickly and you say they're more engaged, they're not following news about Israel as much. So you can see that they're in some ways the personal groups are doing more of some behaviors than even the involved group. And that's why we call them personal. So this is their way of engaging Jewish life. It's a quarter of Jews. Very interesting, and I think a lot of opportunities there.
Thanks, Janet. So I want to thank Jan. I want to thank everybody else who's here with us and the whole Greater Metro West Jewish community. There's so much rich data here and so much to think about. It's really the beginning of a conversation. And these questions are great because they're starting to help unpack and sort of peel back the layers of what the data can mean for us. Because that's the next set of conversations. What does this mean, and what might we do in response to the data that the community study has shared with us to strengthen our Jewish community? So we're doing that at Federation. We're sitting around the same type of conversations with our lay leaders and our professionals, working together in partnership to think about what are the trends from across the community study reports, and then to identify priority areas for attention and exploration based on the data. And as we continue to do that work at Federation, we'll be sharing that out with all of you in the weeks and months ahead. And so, and as you have these conversations in your synagogue communities, if additional questions about the data arise, and we surfaced a bunch of them tonight, or if you want to dig into some aspect of the study, please be in touch with me. We'll be happy to be in partnership with you to support your thinking about strengthening the Jewish community in any ways that we can. So with that, I want to say Toda Rabba again. Thanks so much to everybody. Thanks, Janet, for your presentation and your thoughtful answers to the questions. Thanks, everybody, for being here with us tonight and participating. And wishing you a happy Thanksgiving and almost Hanukkah Sameach to everyone.